Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. I am Liz, joining you as usual. Can I speak today? Usual from Central Virginia and the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation. And I'm so glad that you are with us today. And this is going to be a super special conversation. But before we jump in, I want to remind you that my book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine, is now available wherever you buy your books. Yay. This book is my love letter of sorts to the sacred feminine. It includes all kinds of historical research, plus my personal experiences walking this path, as well as a lot of insights I've gleaned from guests that have joined me on the show. And I've been encouraging people to purchase it directly from my publisher, Womancraft Publishing, because it's an amazing woman-owned business, or from your local bookstore. But I would also be really grateful for your Amazon reviews. If you liked the book, would you please consider leaving a review of it with Amazon or with Goodreads? That would be so helpful. Just like with the podcast, reviews help other people find this kind of information. And one of the main reasons I wrote the book was because when I started researching the sacred feminine, I felt like I was kind of starting from scratch, and it was hard for me to find information. So I think any way we can make this easier and more accessible is a good thing. So as one of my mentors says, if it would be in your joy, I would love your support in getting the word out about this book and this work. And now let's get on to our show, shall we? So this conversation has been in the works for a long time now. I'm so excited that it's finally happening. And I'm just going to jump right in and introduce you to our guest today, because I have a feeling, actually, I was putting my questions together and the list was getting longer and longer. So we'll see what we can get to. Sophie Strand is a writer in the Hudson Valley who focuses on the intersection of spirituality, storytelling, and ecology. But it would probably be more authentic to call her a neo-troubadour animist with a propensity to spin yarns that inevitably turn into love stories. Give her a salamander and a stone, and she'll write you a love story. Sophie was raised by house cats, puffballs, possums, raccoons, and an opinionated crippled goose. In every neighborhood she's ever lived in, she's been known as the Walker. She believes strongly that all thinking happens interstitially between beings, ideas, differences, mythical gradients. Her first book of essays, The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, is newly released from Inner Traditions, and her eco-feminist historical fiction reimagining of the Gospels, The Madonna Secret, will also be published by Inner Traditions in 2023. She is joining us today from her home in the Hudson Valley. Sophie, welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Liz, it's so amazing to be here, especially because we've been in the same kind of spiritual, ecological community for such a long time. And I've loved and listened to this podcast. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. And so here's some couple of little backstory pieces for people who are listening. So Sophie's parents, Clark Strand and Perdita Finn, were my very first guest on this show. And if you've heard me, wax on about my love of the Divine Feminine Rosary, I credit her parents with that, which I talk about in that first episode. And then also, for if any of you joined us for Revelry last fall, Sophie was part of that as well. She brought some of her poetry to that event. So, yeah, like I said, I feel like this conversation has been in the works for a while, so I'm so glad it's happening. And usually where I start, Sophie, is getting a little bit of a sense of people's spiritual background. I just find it, right? I know, I find it interesting. Well, everybody's got a good story to tell. And I especially find it interesting when people start in one place and end up somewhere else. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I oftentimes say that I grew up in a spiritual compost heap. That my parents write a lot about the history of religion and spirituality, and they're also really interested in creating non-hierarchical interfaith groups that can pray together despite their different backgrounds. And so, my dad is an ex-Buddhist monk. My mom, had converted to Catholicism, left it, became pretty much a pagan, wild, magical woman. Half of my family are Jewish. So I was raised around Theravada Buddhist monks and rabbis and nuns and theologians and philosophers and eco-anarchists all talking together at the dinner table and sharing food. And what was really prized above all was the ability to speak across differences and to not hold up one faith over the other, but to say that they were all equally important. They were different doorways into the same experience of an ecstatic divine. And so, yeah, I was definitely shown that spirituality had a root system, that it was primarily place-based. It was your relationship with the natural world, with your community, and that, of course, there could be different words and gods and goddesses attached to that, but it had to really stitch you intimately into the beings that constituted your environment. And so, yeah, I was raised in the shadow of Overlook Mountain in the Hudson Valley. We rehabilitated possums and skunks and crippled swans. We had cats and dogs. I spent much of my time outside with mushrooms and lichen and worms and grubs. And my parents were very animistic in that they wanted to share with me that everything was alive, but it was alive differently than me. And that it was that difference that would keep me asking questions and dialoguing with a world that I believed could answer me. That I wasn't speaking at the world, I was speaking to it, beckoning it to respond. And so I would say my spiritual background is animistic, but also with a composting of many other different traditions, be they Jewish, be they Tibetan Buddhist, Zen Buddhism, Christianity, Catholicism, all of these different things intermingling in me and sparking in me a curiosity about how these religions have become the tool of ecocide and capitalism and racism. What were their root systems? How were they originally created? How have they been co-opted by these problematic violent regimes? And so, in college, this was something I really studied in an academic sense, but I've also done it outside of academia in my own life. Yeah, so that's the spark notes of it.
Well, and it sounds like, rather, it's like a lot of times I talk to people, it seems like they start in one place and then there's sort of this pivot. And I think those are people who are not raised necessarily in this kind of compost heap that you describe. But it sounds like what you're describing, like where you started has become more and more you, I suppose, as you've, matured. I mean, does that feel true? It doesn't sound like you've,
I would say there are pivot. I would say there are pivot points for sure. Okay. I think for me, I didn't think about spirituality or religion very much when I was, I would say from like early adolescence to the point when I was 16, I felt dramatically violently ill with a mysterious ailment that took about 8 years to get a correct diagnosis because it was so rare. And so I would say that I was very academic and interested in philosophy, but that I was reintroduced to an interest in mysticism and spirituality through this grappling with illness. So yes, my parents definitely gave me a lot of background that was helpful, but I had to find it again myself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and the other question that I ask people, kind of right out of the gate when I do these interviews is about their understanding of the sacred feminine. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say about this. And I've been reframing that question of late to, the sacred feminine, first of all, is language I use. So please feel free to use any language that makes more sense to you. But I'm wondering how you relate to this concept, and also, because I know you've written about it, what you might see as the limitations of that lens as well.
Thank you for asking that. So I always say that I would say my own personal spiritual inquiry as apart from my parents' background and the way that the information that they gave me was that I became obsessed with how these feminine divinities had been suppressed and co-opted, turned into monsters inside of empires' rewrites of older pantheistic, environmentally conscious stories. I read The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler, Anne Baring's work with the myth of the goddess. I was obsessed with these goddess images, and especially with how Mary Magdalene had seemed to be a key part of the tradition, the original Yeshua, Jesus tradition, who gets ridden out and demonized. And so, and my novel is definitely trying to resurrect all of the women who are part of that, the Second Temple period, Palestine, and part of the Jewish culture of the time period that get excised from the story of Jesus. We just uphold his 12 apostles and not all the other beings who were making the food, who were also keeping this all going. We know in Luke that the wealthy women financially funded the ministry. So I was very interested in how the feminine had been denigrated spiritually and historically, and how that had led to certain kinds of cultural limitations today. I think for me, my problem, this understanding has developed over time, which is, I think that when we use terms like divine feminine and sacred masculine, and my book has that in its title, we can become, unfortunately, limited to a value dualism that doesn't bear much reality in the rest of the entangled biological world. And it kind of locks us into an anthropocentric divine. And the truth is that I think the divine feminine is leaky, that it's the earth, it's the matrix, it's the soil. It's the place where one rhizome, one root system leaks into another root system. It's trees that are connected by mycorrhizal fungi below the soil, where it's hard to tell where one gender ends and another begins, where one self ends and another begins. So I would say that, you know, if Eurocentric capitalism rests on all of these binaries that say one thing is normative and one thing is deviant, and the deviant thing is usually anything other than a white male, the opposite of that is not going to be to re-articulate a binary and say there's a divine feminine and the sacred masculine. For me, the opposite is actually saying that gender is complex, it's multivalent, it's always evolving. Identity should be lunating. It should not be static. You know, if anything is static, it's dead. You know, identity should never be static. Divinity should never be static. So while I have really benefited from an inquiry into the divine feminine and understanding my own ways in which I identify as feminine, and understanding socio-historically how sexism has developed alongside religion, I feel like that's absolutely key. It's not a term that's necessarily big enough for me these days. And I think sometimes it can lock us into a kind of human-centric narrative. So I always say, you know, yes, there are a lot of goddess figurines, but actually the most predominant motif artistically in cave paintings and early art are polyphonic meshworks of beings, and then the humans barely register. They're stick figures. You know, obviously Barbara Ehrenreich writes that obviously these were skilled artisans who could draw complex figures, and they were drawing very detailed textures, bisons and oryx and lions, and the humans were always just stick figures. That the most important thing was not a hero or a human, but a map of relationships and relationality. So how can we think of divinity as maps of relationships, forests of mycorrhizal fungi and trees and orchids and many different beings, rather than as one fixed identity?
Mm-hmm. And I want to read, actually, these are your words, and I liked them so much that I quoted you in my book. So I'm pulling up my book, but it's the same as what's in your book. This just happens to be closest to me. Divine feminine just isn't big enough for all the relationships holding and constituting me these days. She thins my language into a one-to-one relationship. Even if she includes saints and Mother Earth and all women, it's easy to slip into monic language. One mother, one relationship, one sacred gender expression, one temporality, one thinking animal, one species. I'm not throwing her out, I'm throwing her in. Melting her down, mixing her into the messier polytemporal animacy of everything I touch, change, and become. I love that so much. And I know the first time I read it, I was like, no. It was sort of like this childlike response of wanting to hold on to this idea of the sacred feminine, which had been so healing to me, just to have the counterpoint to the masculine kind of monotheistic, male tradition that I was given. And I wonder if you look like you want to say something. I wonder if you've encountered that perspective from others as well.
Well, I would say the divine, I work by process of addition, never negation. I never throw anything out, because that's the logic of the oppressor, is that we work by antibiotic. We kill off the things we don't enjoy, we throw them out. But the truth is, there's no throwaway culture. You're just throwing your poison offloading it onto some other community. That the more generous, complicated thing is to take responsibility for everything. And so for me, divine feminine is a portal. It's a doorway. It's not a destination. It's the first step. So I love that. And what I think the divine feminine is the first step out of monotheistic, Eurocentric paradigms. And so you can't skip that step. You have to say the feminine has been degraded, and the feminine is conflated with nature has been a really huge aspect of these Mediterranean religions that have then become a key part of colonialism. So I think the divine feminine for me was, if I hadn't gone through the portal of the divine feminine, I wouldn't be who I am today. Yes. It is a sacred doorway.
Yes, I love that you describe it that way, as a portal or a doorway. And I think I feel like my experience has been similar too. And so while I said, that first reaction was like, no, I want to hold on to this. Which, by the way, if you as a listener are having that reaction, hold on. Maybe you need it. Like I think that the difference is right when we try to make that dogma and put it on somebody else, then now we've got the reverse of what we have at this moment, and that is not helpful. Um,
No.
but when I really sat with what you wrote, Sophie, and so I want to tell you this little nugget and tell my listeners this too. I had one of my first teachers of divine feminine kind of wisdom told me that one of the greatest gifts that people can give you is to make you uncomfortable, to have an opportunity to really think and to be challenged in that way. So I appreciate being challenged in that way. And I took that thought, and then I thought about my own experience, which has become more and more over time nature-based, and how one of my own most important practices is just going in the woods behind my house and sitting on a bench out there, preferably at dusk, and just listening and watching and waiting to see what happens. And it's very divine. It is so divine. And I really questioned for myself, I'm like, am I calling this the goddess right now? Well, I can, but
Yeah.
sure. And it's so much larger. um so I feel like I understand what you're saying, very much so, with the doorway and the entryway into seeing things differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I've learned most from the things that have triggered me the most.
Yeah.
And I think a lot. So my area of study and the thing I've written most about is Jesus as a Jewish Galilean storyteller in a very particular time when Jewish people have been oppressed by the Roman Empire and are experiencing radical acts of violence against them, and poverty and illness. And I've been very interested in how we've kind of neutered Jesus's language by translating it into the language of the oppressor, uprooting it from the very specific ecology he was responding to with all of these nature-based parables. So we lose the radical anti-imperial anarchic language when we put it through this game of telephone. And what I've been very interested about Jesus's parables is that actually when you put them back in Aramaic, put them back into a very particular social anthropological setting, they were designed to make people really angry, to make peasants really angry. When he says the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, he's saying this is a weed that will destroy your crop so that you cannot feed your family and you cannot pay your taxes. So the kingdom of God, it's not at a distance, it's not somewhere else, it's here, and it's this thing that will destroy your livelihood and be absolutely complicated. So that's going to make people angry. And John Dominic Crossan, who writes a lot about the anthropological and theological basis of Jesus and the historical Jesus as a Mediterranean peasant, says, if his teachings had just been blithely accepted, they never would have been remembered, that they were designed to create interruption because people would disagree with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, which is how can we think about pedagogy as being about creating enough tension that a conversation blooms, so that it's not a monologue, so that it's a dialogue between people, like who are massaging and prickling these things together.
Oh my gosh. And even as you say that, I'm like, wow. And what interesting territory to be entering into right now at this particular moment in time, where I feel like our cultural dialogue is so deeply rooted in opposites, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what is that experience like for you? Even advocating that sort of a middle ground feels too simple, but like the all inclusivity that you're talking about.
I'm not interested in middle grounds as being some kind of homogenizing universalism where everyone's making compromises and in
Yeah.
some way self-betraying. I'm interested in ecotones, which are places where one ecosystem dramatically interfaces with another and changes into another, where like the grassland immediately becomes the forest, and they actually usually represent this fertile boundary whereby there's more biodiversity, like more diversity of fish and birds. Ecotone comes from the Greek words eco for household, oikos, and tonos for tension. So it's a place where tensions are held, and because they're not dissolved, they're held, and the paradox is allowed to create friction, generative friction. There's more biodiversity, more happens. And so I'm very interested in coming into conversation with people who I risk changing my own mind, who risk changing me. That if I only ever talk to people who think like me, I'll never evolve. I'll never change my thinking. And so, I don't want to come into conversation with someone. Well, but here's the thing that's also interesting, which is if you cut, someone said this to me recently, and I forget who said, when you're having a conversation with someone you disagree with, you have to ask, what would it take to change your mind? And if they don't have any answer to that and there's nothing, then it's not worth having a conversation. Then it's just two people monologuing. But if you're conversing with someone who's also willing to play with you, then something very interesting can happen there.
Mm-hmm.
How are you experiencing this in your own life?
Do you mean in terms of like the sacred feminine, that conversation around that?
Well, especially given that you come from a pretty I mean, you come from a religious background that perhaps would not accept that.
Yes. Right. Well, I mean, I could answer that in multiple ways. I think, and this journey has been like multi-year for me at this point, right? So I think initially, well, I mean, I can think of it like an outward expression, like trying to interact with people. It's sort of explaining what this is and what I'm doing and running into the opposition, and how I manage that personally is very challenging for me because I come out of that sort of either or environment. I find that I don't even know how to answer this. I was going to say, like, I started to say, like, people have gotten worn down perhaps by what I talk about and what I do, or just or that it's often met with opposition, and then opposition isn't necessarily a no. I think it's protection of ego and position. And just because there's a no initially doesn't mean that it's going to not be a seed that sprouts in some other way. And it's something that I kind of have to let go of and not really hold myself and just be with it. In terms of what this specific kind of conversation about where the divine feminine is and, the evolution of it, I have found for myself, just as a reflection of even when I started this podcast and to now, and when I started my Facebook group to now, wanting to have some of more of these, I want to say edgier, I guess it would be kind of slightly edgier conversations about what this means and what direction it takes. And I also want to have those conversations in terms of, we can't just talk about the oppression of women and reclaiming the sacred feminine without talking about all the other ways that patriarchal systems have impacted us. So it's not productive to have just that conversation if we're not also talking about racism or ableism or all of the ways in which this is played out. I feel like am I kind of answering your question? I sort of going off on a tangent.
You definitely are. Yeah. No. And I think the thread I'm hearing that I'll pull out is intersectionality, which is, if patriarchy is about saying that a very narrow type of identity is normative, then the opposite is to say that we're all entangled and relational, and we're going to do our best work when we join hands across differences.
Yeah. And even when that's hard, I have noticed that there's a real push for unity in the sacred feminine community. Like we're all having the same experience kind of feel, and we're not, and we are not. And even if I had not a podcast, I had a Facebook group member point this out to me a while back, which was so helpful. She's Indian American and is a Hindu. And she's like, look, this whole strive to reclaim the sacred feminine in the United States and in Europe is very much tied up with women's rights. Like there's this whole women's empowerment thing that's happening. It's a different conversation somewhere like that, where they have been worshiping goddesses for many thousands of years, right? And men worship goddesses there as well. And so the empowerment piece starts to come in when you're looking at what colonialism did, as opposed to, they didn't lose the divine feminine. But what impact has colonization had on norms there? And that is a much more nuanced conversation than saying patriarchy killed the goddess, right? Like it's much more nuanced.
Yeah. And did patriarchy kill the goddess, or is the death of the goddess and patriarchy, are they both symptomatic of something even earlier?
Yeah.
And I think that's
interesting.
Something I'm interested in is like, when do we see these hierarchies develop? When do we see this type of domineering behavior as, decoupled from a certain kind of gender essentialism? I'm really interested in how agriculture and surplus food and kind of sessile living, when you stop actually roaming across the land, following the phenological tides of different species fruiting and dying back, when we start to stay still, our ways of making culture start to stay still, and they get stuck in a very particular way of ordering identity.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in how alphabetic cultures creates a complete conceptual paradigm shift, whereby suddenly, instead of thinking that language is relational, it's infused with a breath that ties one interior to another interior, it's always adapting. Suddenly we're always seeing the mirror of ourselves in these texts that allow for a totally abstract world to develop. And alongside that abstract world are certain kinds of abstract classifications that buttress up patriarchy and colonialism.
Mm-hmm. I have so many thoughts as you were saying that. Do you have thoughts on like kind of, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of thinking it, well, it's Rian Eisler's language is more around domination, cultures of domination, right? That doesn't necessarily tie to patriarchy, but you reference like what might even be before that kind of gender language. Do you have thoughts on that, or?
I think it's tied to, here's the thing. There's a game whereby we're always looking for an origin. And that impulse is informed by a kind of linear temporality that is also paired to cultures of domination.
Right.
So in fact, maybe we should problematize this desire to always locate one cause, one origin, and say it's multi-causal. There are a lot of different things that happen. It is interesting to play with different ideas and see how they can expand and widen our understanding. It does seem interesting that when you see fermentation vats and mass agriculture, you see the first instance of mass executions. So whenever you have like mass fermentation, you have mass execution sites. This is really well documented in David Wengrow and David Graeber's The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you if you'd read that. I've been working my way through it. It's going to take me a while to finish it because it's massive.
I have very complicated feelings about that text, but it has really invaluable information in it. So is fermentation the beginning? Sometimes I always like to complicate that everything is a human story. Sometimes I say civilization could be a very particular fermented fungal story that's using humans as a mouthpiece, that you see civilization oftentimes arise alongside fermentation. So I'm always just trying to massage these dogmas that we hold as truth, and not trying to settle on one as opposed to the other. Is there one that you find to be most intriguing?
What do you mean?
Well, that represents a real shift from a kind of participatory, nature-reverent culture into these more static cultures of domination. Is there something you see as being kind of a hinge?
Well, what's been interesting to me is kind of arriving the same place you are, that it is a slippery slope to try and come up with one story. Like I'm more interested. And so for that reason, I've been enjoying The Dawn of Everything for their examples of, hey, here is a culture who started agriculturally and then went backwards and decided they didn't want to do it because it didn't make sense to them. So they went back to gatherer hunters, or they've got lots of examples that sort of challenge that one overarching narrative. And I've even seen this in the sacred feminine literature. There is, whether it's implied or outright spoken, I feel like there is an assumption, like I said, that patriarchy killed the goddess, and that happened around the world. It was aligned with agriculture, the rise of agriculture, and this is a set story and it's done. And it isn't done. I mean, you can look at the story of Guadalupe, for example. This happened 500 years ago. We're not talking about now. Certainly, I'm no expert on Mexican culture and what was happening then, and I would decouple that from a conversation about women's rights. But the reality is, the goddess was not dead. What happened is, again, colonialism. That is what really changed things there. And so I'm interested in that kind of pulling apart those narratives that just become too one-dimensional, too simplistic.
Yeah, and I also think it's very, very hard to kill deities or cosmologies, and it's much easier to reinterpret them and to syncretically syncretically include them in a new cosmology. And so what I say is monster myths are mother myths. You can't kill the mother, but you can turn her into a monster, like Tiamat, who is, the Sumerian mother goddess, suddenly becomes this monstrous dragon that Marduk has to kill.
Right.
We also see this with Medusa, who is probably representative of these older epiphonic snake goddesses of like Cretan culture, who's, when the Greek hordes come down and need to subjugate these other people, they can't get rid of the goddess. She's too deeply rooted, but they can reinterpret her. So what I think that does is it gives us a more complex way of having a context myth analysis, where we say, who are the monsters of today's myths, and what could they be hiding? What's in the root system? Could it be something funkier, sexier, more nature reverent?
Well, and this kind of leads me to your book too, because I guess what I think of when you say that is also that we have the opportunity to do the same thing, right? Yeah. Which I feel like is, I want to hear you talk about your book, The Flowering Wand, but it felt very much like that's what you were doing, so there's this one idea, right? Which we can just harken back to the past and try to figure out what was going on there. And that's interesting for sure. And we can start to tell new stories based on what we've got here too. And I find that infinitely interesting. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your inspiration with this collection of essays that you put together about the masculine.
Thank you for that wonderful question. Oftentimes, the very quick paraphrase is I say, reroot, rewild, retell, which is in oral traditions, which were 90% of human history. Every time you told a story, it changed to suit your audience, the weather, the political, social pressures of a particular moment. So storytelling should be constantly be changing and moving. So to pretend like old myths from different ecosystems can be transplanted into a totally different environment and time period doesn't exactly make sense. They need to be updated and adapted. But first, what we need to do is we need to reroot them in their original ecosystem to figure out what they were really saying. So Jesus is always my example, which is Jesus has become this white figure of colonial genocide. But what he really was a brown oral storyteller who was doing hands-on healing and saying, invite everybody to the table and oppose empire. And so how does rerooting Jesus in a particular time period, in a particular language and assemblage of practices, open up his teachings into something much more relevant today? And then how can we use those to create our own environmental parables where we live now? Mustard seeds aren't going to teach us something in the Hudson Valley, but I can look at the invasive species and the things that farmers consider weeds here and say, what stories do you have to tell me today? And so what I'm always saying is like, we can reroot these myths that have been deracinated from their original cultures by colonialism, and we can look at what they were really trying to say, and then we can use them to direct us back into a dynamic relationship with the landscapes where we find ourselves planted, and asking those landscapes how to dialogue about what storytelling could mean. I was talking to magician philosopher David Abram the other day. He said, we can't restore the land without restoring the land, which I loved so much, which is, the land is filled with stories, and we won't be able to understand what the land needs very practically, scientifically, in terms of conservation until we learn how to talk with it again, how to ask it for its stories. So I think someone like Jesus, when we replant him in his actual tradition, in a kind of biblical animism and a Judaism that was very deeply tied to the land as mnemonic device, we can see that Jesus as Yeshua is teaching us how to ask the land questions, ask the land for good of metaphors. We can't take his metaphors. They're at too far a remove, but we can look for our own.
And I'm curious if you would recommend, or obviously, so you've got your book that's coming out in 2023, and I want to talk about that too. But I'm wondering this sort of this version of Jesus that you're talking about. How did you get a handle on him? And do you have any recommendations for listeners that want, outside of your book, of course, which will be out next year, but who want to get more of a handle on this radical storytelling Jesus that you're talking about? Because he's way different than what I grew up with.
Well, I would say I did a class, Myth and Mycelium, with the environmental platform Advaya that I know you have also collaborated with. A wonderful assortment of women who are doing really incredible ecological pedagogy.
Yes. And they were on this show too, actually.
I know, I
last year.
loved that interview. I listened
Yeah.
to that interview and I loved
Yeah.
it. Ruby and Christabel, amazing sisters. But that course was really about assembling all of the different scholars, the biodiversity of scholars that have shown me, and Jewish scholars, because the truth is people forget that Jesus was a Jew attempting to reform Judaism, and that the inclusion of Gentiles happens well after he died. And that it's important to remember that. And in fact, in the context of Judaism, it's not a very effective Judaism. It doesn't stick. And that he's a teacher that actually doesn't have a very long lifespan. I sometimes think we have like the first chapter of a teacher's book. You know, we shouldn't pretend like all spiritual wisdom is in the first year of teaching. Right. What would have happened if Jesus had been allowed to develop his thinking over 10 or 20 years? You know, we oftentimes think we fetishize the crucifixion as the first chapter in a miracle, but really it's a tragedy. It's the interruption of the beginning of the development of a certain kind of nature-based storytelling and teaching that was intimately informed by oral Judaism. I would recommend Rabbi Jesus by Bruce Chilton, who I studied with at Bard College. I would recommend the Gospel Q and the Gnostic Bible, and looking at all of the different apocryphal texts, which actually represented typical Christianity before the Council of Nicaea and the Roman Empire tried to narrow down what was Orthodox and what was heterodox. So the Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels' work with Gnosticism, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip. I would say Elaine Pagels' work is incredible. Neil Douglas Potts' work with the Aramaic. And then, of course, one of the best books, which is a really heavy tome, is The Historical Jesus by John Dominic Crossan, although his lectures are also incredibly informative. And he's really done the on-the-ground historical research with the primary documents, the anthropology, the mythical traditions of the Mediterranean. He's really incredible. But yeah, there are lots of different people. I would say the bibliographies of my book, The Flowering Wand, is a really great place to start.
Oh my gosh. And for anybody who's listening is like, I didn't get all that, I'll put it in the show notes. Don't worry. So you will have it. Oh, man, I had a thought for you and it just kind of flew out of my head. No, I've got it because we're on Jesus. So let's stick with Jesus. And then I do want to go back to the Flowering Wand. I have some other questions around that, but since we're talking about Jesus, I want to hear some of your thoughts about, so it certainly seems like both Mary, Virgin Mary, and Mary Magdalene are much more, I don't know if I can say more, but they seem to me to be much more in our consciousness than perhaps in previous times. And I'm curious what your thought is. So it feels like, again, if we talk about the sacred feminine, there's been like this whole reclamation of Mary and Mary Magdalene, and some of it, well, it runs the gamut, right? Like it's not all history based. There's a lot of like intuitive sort of channeled type stuff. I wonder what your reflections are on these women, your perspective and historical as well that you've looked at.
Well, I would say that actually, if you look at the Marian tradition and the folkloric tradition of Mary Magdalene, there was a deep reverence and folkloric tradition that upheld these women up through the Inquisition. And in fact, the Inquisition was in a certain ways very directed at these heterodox movements that upheld Mary and the Magdalene, and that the Magdalene had a very strong presence in France and Europe that was really, really hard to squelch because it lived in the body, it lived in the story. So you could, burn the text and try to erase these things, but it was hard unless you killed everybody, which is what happened with the Catherine massacre. It was really hard to get rid of this reverence for this feminine counterpart to the male Jesus. And so I would say that it actually hasn't been gone for that long, but it is coming, there's certain ways that feminism, certain kinds of, the resurrection of the Gnostic Gospels, which definitely showed that, Mary was apostle of the apostles. She wasn't just like a woman at the tomb. She was, a teacher. She was, Jesus calls her in the Gospel of Thomas, his koinonos, which means his partner, his peer, his counterpart. And so that, in Europe, there is a long-standing tradition of Marian and Magdalene worship. that we are coming back to from different perspectives now, I am very worried about what I see as an anti-Semitic and pretty racist impulse to make the Magdalene into this red-haired white woman from, from Ireland. And and the truth is that she was probably a Jewish woman who had some kind of money to fund the ministry, as Luke tells us, and who was probably pretty radical because she was opposing certain kinds of Orthodox beliefs that she had probably been raised within. And she was a spiritual quester and able to dialogue with this wild rascal storyteller. So I think it's much more interesting to replant. So here's something, I think that channeling, every time you write fiction, you're channeling. I think we're always opening ourselves up to other influences, but I think channeling can also be a way of masking our biases, our racism, our positionality, our situation. And so I worry a lot about channeled experiences of the Magdalene that erase her Judaism, that erase her Middle Eastern heritage, that erase the complexity and nuance of being a Jewish woman during the Second Temple period Palestine, where the Romans are oppressing her people. And we don't have a lot of documents about Jesus from right when he happened. We have after effect information, but we do have a lot of primary documents about the texture and practices of Jewish life during that time period. And it seems a shame for me to ignore those when we're trying to resurrect these people. We have information about the perfumes and the food that they ate, the prayers that they prayed, the stories they told, the environments, the plants, the animals that they interacted with. And to really honor these people is to honor all of that complexity that they were planted within.
Yeah, it makes me think too, with channeled information, we don't get to erase ourselves as part of that, right? Like we are an interpreter of information, and that interpretation is always going to be in our own language and our own experiences. It's kind of like asking journalists to be 100% objective. That's impossible. We don't erase ourselves like that. So,
So I don't discount channeled work, but I also I hold it with a certain amount of cynicism. And that's why I think fiction is a really interesting place to do channeling work, which is you acknowledge you're a writer and you're using primary documents and you're doing intense research and you're not pretending like you have the full story. You have to go looking for the full story, but also you do bring in a certain kind of divine inspiration, but you're not handing this to someone else as truth. You're handing this to someone else as your creative particular view into something that they might have a different view into.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and in case it sounded like that, I'm not dismissing channeled work either. Well, that's mostly for the listeners. I just want I've read a whole bunch of stuff and I find it all fascinating, and I think that the key is just to hold it. What do I have to glean from this, and what biases might be at play, or how does this not relate to my experience? Oh gosh, I have so many. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's about self-discernment and, Gnosticism, which was opposed to the Orthodox Christianity that develops 200 years after Jesus. So Gnosticism is probably a little bit closer to Jesus. And Gnosticism not as being a homogenizing universalism, but being a diversity of practices that all get kind of lumped under that term. What it prized was gnosis, which is self-discovery of the divine. So each person had their own particular way of accessing the divine. And they could all help each other in a community talk about what that was like. But at the end of the day, your experience of the divine would be very personalized. And I think that is also channeling in creative work. It's your personal gnosis, but it's not necessarily someone else's gnosis.
Yes. And I think this is, again, where we run into problems, right? With the way that our culture is sort of organized and we understand things, is that I'm just thinking of the need to put out this mess like, this is true for all of you because it is true for me, it is going to be true for you, and this is the way it is. And that isn't always very helpful.
No.
Yeah. I want to ask you, I'm sorry to my listeners, I'm like, okay, now I've got you here, I have so many questions, and I want to go back, just hang on, listeners, for conversations about Jesus. So I have one more question for you, and I'm thinking of and curious about your perspective on, so there's the historical man, right? Jesus, you believe Jesus is a historical figure, right? Like there is
I
evidence that he
believe
existed, or no?
there's enough firsthand. I would say that, there have been a lot of conferences about the historicity of Jesus. We have enough. We have Josephus, who is contemporary with Jesus, confirming that Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, was real. So John the Baptist is real, who's associated with Jesus. We also have the Pauline epistles, and we have texts from the apostles that happened pretty much immediately afterwards. So I believe that he was a historical figure. I believe that he probably had very little to do with the Jesus that gets translated into the language of empire and then sterilized down to the synoptic gospels.
Okay, that's great. That's helpful. Is my question for you is this question of, and I guess maybe this will wind us back to your sacred, the Flowering Wand book, is how the myths of the past sort of got transcribed on top of Jesus too. Like, for example, I'm thinking of the similarities between the story of Addis and Jesus, right? And Cybele and, the mother, right? Which you could probably speak to that and explain that to the listeners what that is. But there's some remarkable similarities, right? Of that story, which came out of Rome and within a couple of hundred years before Jesus was said to have lived. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so the thesis of the Flowering Wand is that myths are like mushrooms, which is they look above ground like individuals, but they're connected below ground to a mythic mycelium that is much older and larger than, Jesus looks like a mushroom above ground, but he's connected below ground to a many thousand-year-old Mediterranean mythic mycelium of vegetal gods that die and resurrect, like Osiris, like Dionysus, like Orpheus, like Attis and Adonis, like Dumuzi. I would say. And so I looked at all of these gods are associated with fermentation, with party. They're often the advocate of outcasts and women. They always oppose empire. They're seen as being kind of anathema and a danger to empire. And they never stay still. They come, they inspire kind of emergent, ecstatic, nature reverent behavior. They oftentimes bring some kind of fermented beverage, and then they die, and their bodies are physically mulched back into the land from whence they came. So they kind of rearticulate this vegetal cycle of, fruit up, sporulate, reproduce, pollinate, and then die back to nourish the soil. And I would say that you see Dionysus, Orpheus, Osiris on this kind of virtuous cycle of decay and refruit for many thousands of years. Although each time they fruit up in a specific place, they're very particularly adapted to the conditions that they're responding to. Dionysus he's always given many different names. He always looks different. And he kind of represents an adaptogenic intelligence. So adaptogens are mushrooms or, plant components that go into your immune system, and they don't have a general response. They have their response activates your immune system, and they have a tailored response to your specific set of needs. So I think of these vegetal gods as being adaptogenic. Every time they fruit up above ground, they have a very tailored response to a specific time period. I see Jesus as being an interruption in that cycle, because instead of having his body mulched back into the ground and really honoring that death is a physical embodied experience, that it's making yourself edible, making yourself into food, his body evaporates. And when his body evaporates, his sensuality, his nature reverence, his relationship to women, to outcasts, to impurity disappears. And suddenly you interrupt that virtuous cycle. And if you actually look at biology, when you interrupt cycles of decay, really problematic things happen. So during the Carboniferous period, way, way back in deep time, all of this woody matter suddenly evolved, but there was no specific fungus that had developed, no white rot, that could decay that woody matter. So it accumulated really fast. It swamped the earth. It killed many, many other beings. It compacted down. It created an actual climate catastrophe and dropped the temperature and created an ice age. And it's that compacted, undigested matter, it's that interruption in the cycle of decay and refruit that today is powering the fossil fuels that are global warming. And so I sometimes think that, when we interrupt these cycles, they have unintended, chaotic consequences.
That's such a good answer. Well, I'm also wanted to mention too that one of the things that I loved about this book, The Flowering Wand, is the whole the vision of the sacred masculine that it gives us, which is I'm interested in the whole fermentation thing because we've talked about that twice now. I want to come back to that, but there's also something like, okay, so I feel like this is old school language. So many of them seem to be what I feel like we would have called androgynous, but they are gender fluid, right? Or they much more so than I think what patriarchy gives us in terms of like our standard operating procedures for men today, right?
Well, I would say that we call anything that's not patriarchal masculinity androgyny. But the
Yes.
truth is that, 2,000 years ago, there was a biodiversity of masculine expressions that were on a rhizomatic continuity with feminine expressions.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we look at many other indigenous cultures, they have, instead of having binaries, they have mycelial systems of self-identification. And oftentimes, I'm very interested in the Gala, who were the priests and priestesses who worshipped Inanna. And Inanna was given power. Inanna was actually considered divine because she could change your gender. And she was oftentimes represented with both breasts and a phallus, and sometimes with a beard. And Inanna, as rearticulated and developed into Venus and Aphrodite on Cyprus, is often shown as having both genders, and being able to kind of flow between both of them. And I think that masculinity used to be much more playful, that it lunated through many different forms rather than being stuck in one solar linear ray of sunshine coming down,
Yeah.
And patriarchy and masculinity have been conflated, but patriarchy represents one narrow flavor of masculinity. And what I wanted to show is there are many different ways of embodying the masculine. And in fact, you should be allowed to play with them every day. You don't have to decide on one and perform it and stick to it. You can lunate through them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's funny, Sophie, as you were talking, it's like I was thinking, gosh, I want to ask her, how did we get here? I want the one story of how we got here with this stuck with the patriarchal male, which is so funny because what we've been talking about is that there isn't one story. It just goes to show that kind of thinking is really deep rooted, isn't it? I mean,
it is, yeah. We can notice it, we can do it, and then we can notice it. It's all about the minute we demonize our own patterns, we also kind of get stuck there. So we can say, yeah, there is an impulse. I do have a desire. And this book was written with a desire to look backwards, but I also didn't want to just look backwards. I wanted to retell these stories with a certain kind of playfulness, taking quantum physics and modern biology, mycology, and fungal science in order to retell these things with some of our new tools and new ways of seeing how life emerges.
yes. And I'm trying to think about how do I put this into words? Well, and even when we are exploring this stuff, I find that it's so easy to slip into binaries, right? Of like even the binary of, oh, this is the way it was back then, and this is the way it is now. Like there's this clear sort of delineation, and even those are our only options, as opposed to the creativity of taking, I guess, what you're talking about and sort of imagining what might be possible for the future. That becomes a different option that gets on the table, it seems to me, when you start to play with the myths in this way.
Yeah, I mean, it's very paired with a very narrow idea of how time happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I've recently been looking at how in ancient Egypt there was an idea that there was cyclical time, so time was always repeating. And then there was the time of the pharaohs. When the pharaohs die, they pass into the time of the gods, which isn't past, it's always there, but it doesn't change. So there's this changeless time that's happening alongside cyclical time, but there's no linear time. And when you start thinking about that, those cycles, you stop getting stuck in this kind of night or day, either or thinking. And so sometimes I think we need to kind of problematize our idea of how time happens, and that having a more fluid understanding of temporality can help us understand that the past is happening today. Every time we reinterpret the past is still happening for us, and that the future refluxes into us. That, in a lot of amazing scientific studies, we show that the human instant may not actually represent now. It may be a version of now that is actually much wider. And that in something called Lippitt's delay, people's bodies responded to electrical shocks before they even got them. or knew that they were going to get them.
Wow.
And it's one of these amazing, like, strange anomalies, but they've repeated it. And so I love the idea of limits delayed. It complicates our idea of like where the future is. Sometimes I like to think that the future is refluxing into us, and that there's a guardian angel of my own self in the future that's pulling me forward.
Oh, I love that idea for sure. And I that resonates with me a lot. I want to ask you, this is a little bit of a personal question, but I loved how in your acknowledgments, your final acknowledgement was to Dionysus, and you said that life had gotten a lot weirder since he showed up for you. And I'm wondering if you might be able to share about that weirdness. What does that look like to invite this kind of God into your life?
It's interesting. I did a lot of research on Dionysus to write my novel about Jesus, because I knew that that Dionysian traditions get melded syncretically with early Christianity, and that they happened alongside each other geographically. And I thought it would be important. But the truth was, I spent a lot of time writing and researching Jesus, and Jesus is a tragedy. He's an interruption. He doesn't get to fully form his religion. His religion is deeply impinged by imperialism and violence. He's reactionary. You know, we have to think of Jesus as a human who was probably having traumatic responses. And, you know, his teacher, Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, is killed. You know, when he was 4, probably he had seen the mass execution of all of the Jews involved in Judas the Zealot's revolt. So he's a complicated, traumatized person who is trying hard to create a spirituality that might be more nutritious to peasants alongside him. But it's a tragedy. It's hard. It's painful. It's not necessarily spiritually an embrace. It's tricky. You have to stay with the trouble to kind of summon Donna Haraway, who's one of my favorite thinkers. Dionysus, on the other hand, had a very, very long, stable tradition that, you know, it becomes, the Romans are worried about how anti-imperial he is and how he disrupts established order. He actually inspired the 2 almost successful revolts against the Roman Empire. Populia Ania, who was a witch in Campania, and Spartacus. Spartacus was a Dionysian follower, inspired by his wife, who was supposed to be a priestess of Dionysus. And I was interested as Dionysus as being a more fertile, healthy version of what Jesus is rearticulating. And so when I started, finally, after I'd finished my novel, I was in quarantine. I was depressed. I was lonely. I had to quarantine alone because of health reasons. And I was researching Dionysus again just to keep myself kind of intellectually flexible. And I thought, you know, this feels healthier to me. It's more vegetal. It's more embodied. It's playful. It has a sense of humor. And there's no tragedy inherent that interrupts it. It keeps cycling.
Yes, I greatly enjoyed all of that in your book too, sort of reconnecting with that. I didn't know much about Dionysus before reading that, so I really appreciated that. I'm curious for you, what does spiritual practice look like for you in your life? How are you accessing?
I think if you're spiritual, okay, my spiritual practice is evidence-based. If what I'm doing is bringing me into contact with more beings outside my door, with my community, then it's real. If my spiritual practice is helping me be a better citizen of a complex entanglement of microbes, fungi, insects, indigenous populations, communities, neighbors, then it's real. You know, if my religious practice is all up in my head, if it's some kind of rearranging of abstract concepts, if it's not lived in my body and in my web of relationships, it's not real. So I'm always interrogating my spiritual practices to make sure they have a root system. Do they root me in a particular place? Do they root me into my community, my community that extends beyond the human? And I think this isn't a destination you reach. This is a constant self-inquiry. You know, is my spiritual practice actually helping me be a better member of my web of relationships? Yeah.
I love that perspective. That's beautiful. And then I wanted to ask you too, and I already don't like the question, so let's just take it. You just run with it how you want. You will. But I want to ask you, there's It's a question around hope, or around like where we see us going in the future, right? We just talked about how future and past are all kind of tangled up and whatnot, but there's, and I talk about this on the show a lot, about, just the bleakness that we are facing all around us, and you can take that from any angle that you want. I mean, the environmental one is obvious, but there's all kinds of ways you could take that, right? And so I wonder, for you, is hope even a concept that you work with? And no, what do you
No.
see for a future?
As someone who has seen, I'm a survivor of violent childhood sexual abuse, and I've seen the depths of hell, and I've seen it rearticulated again and again. I've seen things happen that leak past our simplistic ideas of right and wrong, and they happen in a way that ruptures meaning. And I see the way we're treating the earth, and I think this is bigger than my narrow perspective. And I like to plant ourselves in deep time, which is, it's not that we're on some trajectory towards optimization. Every species eventually goes extinct, that we are in fact the product of extinction, that 75 to 90% of all species were wiped out when the dinosaurs were destroyed by the meteor strike. I forget what it was called, the Chicxulub, I think the Chicxulub meteorite that hit us. And it was in that space opened up, that empty space left behind by a mass extinction, that mammals finally diversified and filled these empty niches and created us. So we are the product of a sacrificial extinction event. So we have to understand ourselves as being part of a narrative that is much bigger than the human. And when you start to feel that, then human survival doesn't feel like a priority. Like it's important in as much as I am a human in relationship with other humans, but the most important thing is the enlivenment of the world in general, the dynamic homeostasis of Gaia as a wild biospheric entity, and there's going to be a respiration of extinction, diversification, extinction, diversification on deep time scales that are so much bigger than a human lifetime. And so when I think when we can begin to engage with these much longer time scales, we can understand that we are part of a story where we are not the main character. That being said, when you get awake to the harm that we're doing, when you think of yourself as a spider within a web of relations, we're showing more and more that spiders think with their whole web, such that when you damage part of the web, they act as if they had a stroke. When you think of yourself as a spider within a web of relations that include the soil, the moss, the deer, the people all around you, when you think of those beings being hurt by extractive ecocidal behavior, you want to stop it. Your body is being harmed as well. Your extended body is being harmed. So, and I'm in no way saying that we should not act to stop this behavior, but I also think we should problematize this idea that we will optimize ourselves and prolong human survival.
Yeah, I hear that. And the mother in me wants to say, like, but I want this world to be here for my kids, like the human entanglement there is very real. Right.
And that's why every day we wake up and we protect our kin that are our kin biologically, and our chosen kin, the kin that build us very metabolically with every microbiome laced breath. We're fighting for our children and for the beings that constitute us.
Totally.
That's a great question. Thank you.
I feel like I have so many more. Okay. I think this is a good place to stop. Like we could, I think this is a good place to stop.
I love the idea of complicating the idea of a completion. Let's leave ourselves unsatisfied, so this conversation will begin at another point, that it will sprout other conversations. Like I feel like we could talk much more, and let's do that.
Yes, may it be so. Well, I'd love to have you come back next year when your next book is out as well. That would be fantastic. So consider the invitation extended. Sophie, tell us how people can find you and your work.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I'd love to send you an early copy of the Madonna Secret.
That'd be amazing.
So when that's ready, I will definitely make sure that makes its way to you. I'm on social media at Cosmogony on Instagram. I'm on Twitter, on Facebook. I have a Substack where I post a lot of free essays and then private content if you wish to support me. But I always want to give away enough free information that I honor how much I've benefited from the generosity of other artists and thinkers. So you can find me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Substack. I'm doing a Rewilding mythology course with Advaya. You can sign up at any point during the course and access past sessions and resources. That's at rewildingmythology.com. And I have 2 books that are coming out, The Flowering Wand, and many book events that are going to be happening in conjunction with those. So follow me on social media for more updates about those. I love to be in conversation, so come bother me.
Yes. And I will make sure I get all this in the show notes. Our show notes are going to be really long, y'all. I took a lot of notes here. All good. Thank you so much, Sophie. What a rich and wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we finally made this happen.
That was one of the best conversations I've had. What thoughtful questions. Thank you. I'm like really, really touched by what care you took. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you guys, the listeners, as always. I'm so grateful that you're here. This wouldn't be any fun if nobody was listening on the other end. So thanks for listening. And I meant to say this in the beginning in case y'all turn this off at the end, but hey, get in touch with me. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about the essays. I love it all. So send me a note, social media. You can email me, liz@hometoher.com. And if you like the show, you can give it a favorable review. You can tell your friends about it. You can subscribe. You can do all those things. And until next time, take good care. I will talk to you again very soon.